Okay, so I'm not sure how many people are online for this webinar, but you're all very welcome. My name is Paddy Kenny. I'm an orthopaedic surgeon. I'm a member of council in the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland, and I'm also one of the two national clinical directors for the trauma and orthopaedic program. And the meeting, we're at this meeting this evening, we're going to discuss fracture liaison services. And we have two extremely dedicated and at this stage experts in the field of fracture liaison services who are going to talk to us. The National Clinical Programme for Trauma and Orthopaedics published a model of care in 2015, and in that model of care we advocated strongly for a fracture liaison service. And a fracture liaison service is a coordinator-based secondary fracture prevention service implemented in healthcare systems for the treatment really of patients with osteoporosis. The Trauma Steering Group, in its report, A Trauma System for Ireland, which was published in 2018, also highly recommended and that a fracture liaison service should be established nationally. The first meeting of the National Fracture Liaison Service programme in Ireland was in 2018 and initially started under the auspices of the National Clinical Programme for Trauma and Orthopaedic Surgery. There are a lot of people in our committee from a lot of different specialties, including gerontology, orthopaedic surgery, endocrinology, rheumatology, endocrinology, physiotherapy, occupational therapy. There's a lot of people involved because it's a cross-specialty problem, and it's also a community problem. Our first national facilities audit was completed in 2020, and our database was commenced in 2021. And as you'll hear later from Francis and Erin, we are hoping to publish our first national report towards the end of this year. Ireland has the highest per head of population for hip fracture rates in Europe, and about 50% of people who have a hip fracture have had a previous fracture, not necessarily a previous hip fracture, but have had a previous fragility fracture. As you'll hear throughout the course of this evening presentations, early identification and intervention with conservative management, i.e. osteoporosis drugs, can reduce the risk of hip fracture for these patients by up to 70%. And I think it is, the fracture liaison service is established in other countries. It is something that we are on the way to establishing, but really it's a national problem and we have a national solution, but we need to implement it. So our first speaker is Professor Frances Dockery, who is a consultant geriatrician in Beaumont Hospital. She has a special interest in bone health and falls prevention. She is the co-chair with Mr. Aaron Glynn of the Irish Fracture Liaison Service database. She was on the steering group in the UK, and she has a vast experience of fracture liaison services. So without any further ado, Frances, I'd be delighted if you would give us your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Paddy, for the invitation to join and for that and for setting up, in fact, the database in Ireland, with us and your support of it ongoing. Next slide. I won't repeat what you've said, Paddy, but this is a standard that was clearly stated in the trauma system for Ireland, that the HSE should be developing a comprehensive FLS. Now, this is clearly about a medical intervention, really, isn't it? It's about falls prevention and fracture prevention. The target patient group are orthopaedic patients, though. There's no question about that. These are all your patients for the orthopaedic surgeons on this. But really, it's important that you know all about it. It is not an orthopaedic person's job to be dealing with falls and dealing with osteoporosis. But it's really important that you know this is the standard of care all of your patients should be receiving, and that This service should go on seamlessly in the background as part of their acute care. Next slide. The first UK national database was set up by an orthopaedic surgeon, David Marsh. A lot of you may know him very well. He also set up the first hip fracture database in 2007, a decade earlier in England. And really, he just saw this as a complete no-brainer, that all of these patients who are coming through his service from his long career, that so many of these fractures could be prevented. And also because he saw the successes of the hip fracture database. Next slide. That, you know, if only you could emulate the success of the hip fracture database. Next slide. This is the Irish hip fracture database. Next slide. And as you can see, across the years, this goes across, sorry, the bottom is obscured for me, but you'll see that for each year, these clinical standards concern getting the patient out of ED to a ward, getting them to theatre, dealing with bone health and falls prevention. And year on year, there have been improvements across the board. As a result, it's very powerful having a national database because you can audit and benchmark, and people like nothing better than competition to drive up standards. It really does work. So he really thought we must be able to emulate this with non-hip fractures. It's a much bigger challenge though, because hip fractures are all admitted to hospital. They're easy to find. Non-hip fractures, unfortunately, all of the others, only half of them get admitted, and they get admitted under a very broad range of specialties. So it's a much, and there's about 5 times the number of hip fractures in addition. So certainly it was a bigger fish, to say the least. Next slide. But, so hip fracture care certainly has improved greatly, as you can see from those clinical standards, but it's all about, wouldn't prevention be a lot better than cure? And next. So any series on hip fracture patients, about 40% of them have at least one fracture before they broke their hip. And of those, only about 1 in 5 are ever screened or treated for osteoporosis. So it's about, as you can see, even the first vertebral fracture, you'll get away with. Morbidity starts to rise as they increase. Next, hello, can you go forward? Yeah. So currently Ireland has the 6th highest rate of hip fracture in the world. Next slide. And this is the bed days. This is from NICWAS. I took it now. This is primary diagnosis only. Now, if you use secondary diagnosis, it of course is going to change the picture a lot. But it's much harder to extract secondary diagnosis from NICWAS. So I just looked at primary. There are 2 things. Firstly, look at the impact of COVID on all of these diagnoses, which is really interesting. 2020 being the baddie for COVID. As you can see, it really did impact all presentations. But I think this is really quite incredible that fragility fractures use more bed days as a primary diagnosis than any of these conditions. And with our ageing demographics, that is definitely going to be on the increase. So it's important to note. Next, could you go forward? So there's currently about 25, at least, maybe more, hip fractures. These numbers are only the admitted patients. There's another 50% or more of those who are sent home from ED that we know nothing about. And 4,000 hip fractures in Ireland. And the bottom line is obscured for me on this, but
300,000 people with osteoporosis.
Thank you, Kenny. For some reason, it seems to be blocking the bottom of the screen. Europe have this is an estimate from Europe. Okay, it's a global problem. We're not alone here in Ireland with an osteoporosis issue. And go forward. Yes, continue. So the cost, continue. Yeah, so about 37, just under 40 billion is spent. That's the estimate for Europe on looking after hip fractures. And of that, just a really relatively tiny amount is spent on preventing fractures. Next slide. Preventing fractures, there are actually strategies. It's not like there's nothing you can do about this. There is, next slide, or next, can you go forward? This paper is a very good roundup of the osteoporosis drugs. They're not head-to-head studies, but it lists pretty much all of the ones on the market versus placebo. Depending on your fracture risk and your level of osteoporosis, your T-score, any osteoporosis drug will reduce your risk of a fracture by 20 and up to 80%. For example, if you have a vertebral fracture and you go on to teriparatide, for 2 years, you'll have an 80% reduction in fracture risk. So these really are pretty indisputable evidence in the literature out there. Next slide. And it's not just if you have this T-score of -2.5, because that's how you define osteoporosis. That's an artificial number that was instituted by the WHO when they first got DEXA scanning in the, the 70s and 80s when it came into clinical practice. But really, osteopenia, it's all a spectrum. But if you move forward. Yeah, zoledronic acid, it was given only every 18 months. For osteoporosis, normally we give it every year, but even then, a very sizable risk reduction in fractures. Next. So despite this fact, in the US and the UK, there's a real problem. There's a huge downturn in osteoporosis prescribing and treatment rates, and it's a real concern. Next slide. Here in Ireland, this study was from the RCSI. Mary Walsh is a physio from the GP, where she was working at the GP research unit in primary care unit in RCSI. So she had data on patients from 44 GP practices. Q fracture is a sort of a fracture risk score, and you can apply it to a data set. It looks at, for example, risk factors like Parkinson's, falls, prior fracture, steroid use, and apply it to a data set. They pulled out the high risk group, 1 in 4 of them, and only 1 in 10 of the men who were at the highest risk of fracture were on treatment. And the second paper there was 2-year persistent rates. So following up patients who had a new prescription. These studies were done very rigorously and systematically and well described. So only about half of them are still on treatment. Now that's obscured, but I think, if I recall, that only 10% of those who stopped treatment were actually switched over to any other drug. Now that is a real concern for that drug, denosumab. Denosumab is a very effective drug while you're on it, but unfortunately when it stopped, you get a rebound increase in the risk of spontaneous vertebral fractures. And it's something we have seen at least a dozen of in a year in Beaumont, just because we screen vertebral fractures. Because during COVID, they didn't get the blood test you need every 6 months, or they didn't get the injection. So that's the state of play with primary care in Ireland. It's a reasonable snapshot in terms of osteoporosis. Next slide. So what are the barriers? Well, there are lots of them. One I really often think is the terminology, and it has been discussed. Like fragility fracture, is it a low trauma, sometimes low energy? Is it osteoporotic? I've even heard of frailty fracture. Lots of people actually have said this, a frailty fracture, without batting an eyelid. If you actually term these osteoporotic fractures, you're actually going to exclude the majority of fragility fractures, because by definition, most of the fragility fractures, they actually don't have osteoporosis, they've got osteopenia as per their T-score. And like measuring the degree of impact, do they fall down a full flight of stairs or 2 steps or 1? Is it a fragility? Do we see them or don't we? Next. There are a few series where they followed up high impact fractures, and they're also predictive of future risk. You could argue that yes, if they're taking part in high risk sports, they'll have a higher risk of doing that again. But I still think it's important that we shouldn't get too caught up on things like this. And you could argue that all fractures, that this is the time to trigger a very brief global health screen. How did you fall? What's your bone density like? Sarcopenia, etc. Now, wouldn't it be great if we were in a position to be able to take all high risk fractures? I mean, we cannot even, we're only at the tip of the iceberg as regards the low trauma fractures, but I'm only putting it out there as I think sometimes it can be a barrier to getting the right patients through the system. Next. Now, I can't read that. Can someone read it? Because something's blocking the screen for me.
Which fracture types to go case finding for?
Okay, next slide. That's another problem. A lot of times, you can move on to the next slide. Some fracture liaison service, they won't see clavicle, others will, or see patella, some won't see ankles, etc. This is a huge data set, 400,000 female patients over 65 from Medicare. They follow them up for a few years. So on the left, you can see the index fracture they had. So after 1 year, nearly about 10% had another fracture. Now, some were on osteoporosis treatment, but despite that, that's the figure. But as you can see, regardless of the fracture type, increased risk across the board with every single fracture type. So the patients you are seeing, 1 in 10 of them will have fractured the next year. The big high risk group are the spine. Next slide. This is their 2 year, so nearly 20%, 1 in 5 of them had fractured by 2 years. And again, look at, regardless of the index fracture type, all of them were associated with a subsequent fracture risk. Next. And importantly, when it comes to timing, there's a concept of imminent fracture risk that's very important to get across. Over the next decade, once you've ever had a fracture, you're at higher risk for the next 10 years than the background risk for the rest of the population. That is front-loaded into those first 2 years after your fracture. So really, it's important to get onto treatment as quickly as possible. A lot of times we see that people are waiting for a DEXA scan. They actually probably don't need it all. But even if they do need it, it's certainly very helpful. The important thing is get them onto treatment. I will do this if I think there's a wait or a delay to DEXA, and you can stop treatment if you have an entirely normal bone density, but even then, regardless of bone density, for example, hip or spine fractures, you treat them without. So it's really important they get onto an effective treatment early, and they're on it for about 2 years. And while you're waiting for your expensive drugs sometimes, although most drugs are extremely cheap actually, falls risk is critical, particularly in that first year post-fracture, because no drug is going to prevent fractures while you're falling repeatedly. Next slide. Patient barriers are a biggie. I've had falls clinic for years, and I've often thought I'm going to have to call this the trip clinic. That might get a few more of them in and stop such a high DNA rate. And older people, they just put everything, fractures and falls and all sorts of disease, down to their age, which is one of the things that makes it an interesting, challenging but very interesting specialty. Next. And the medics. I've sat at many orthogeriatric MDMs because I did orthogeries for a long time. And mechanical fall, I'd ask how they fell, and they'd say mechanical fall. I'd say, well, what caused the mechanical fall? And blank faces. And it's the same with many medics. How do they fall mechanical? It really doesn't tell anything. When a patient falls, the mechanics have gone wrong, you end up on the ground, even if it's syncope. You know, younger people don't end up on the ground in the same manner. So a lot of it is environmental trip hazards and accidents. It's true, but there are things you can do to prevent them. So I think that's really important to tackle that. I'm not going to deal with falls, except safe to say that specific strength and balance exercise programs are the leading intervention. There is a huge amount of very sound evidence that programs such as Otago, strength and balance, Tai Chi, Pilates, that's what these patients should all be recommended. Obviously, there's a brief triage we ask our fracture liaison practitioners to do to rule out the possibility of syncope and pick up things like blindness, which is not uncommon, and you know, other factors, bad footwear, all of these things, you can really do a lot. Next. So patient, next. Misinformation, you only have to type in osteoporosis drug side effects into Google. Of course, we know Google is now, patients do all their own research. There are some really hair-raising websites out there. That first one talks about drug companies and doctors spinning the numbers and spinning the evidence to suit themselves, to tell people to take drugs. Next. And next, yeah. The Daily Mail, very widely read by too many people. And as you can see, just going back to that slide, can you go back? I mean, that concerns osteonecrosis of the jaw. These were the second study. I mean, osteonecrosis of the jaw is extremely rare. This study was an in vitro study, micro CT scanning of cadaver bone samples, and yet the BBC News picked this up. I mean, really, why would you take a drug when you read these headlines? Next slide. So another big problem really is as to who specialises in osteoporosis, and the problem is it's pretty random, and there's an increasing push for everything to be out into the community with GPs. GPs, do they have time? Well, they say they don't. To keep up with the changing evidence base regarding osteoporosis treatment, particularly now that you have to review treatment after about 5 years, which you do because that's when you see the rare side effects maybe emerging, and also because the benefits tend to reach a plateau at that stage for bisphosphonate drugs anyway. And really to convey risk-benefit to patients effectively. And certainly, next slide. And next slide, based on that, that's the GP data again, as I told you, that's the state of play. So GPs do not really manage this well at the moment because they deal with so much. Next. So putting this together really is a fracture liaison service, and you can scroll through this. Yeah. Next. Yeah, so it's about addressing bone health, falls and the misconceptions and taking the time to do that. But it's really, as I said earlier, important that an FLS forms part of the acute fracture management pathway. But it's also important that it's really invisible to the fracture clinic as it is. Fracture clinics are extremely busy. It's about the acute fracture. But, you know, it's not like this service, and especially COVID has taught us one thing: we can do a lot virtually and we can, you know, be clever about how this happens, but it's important it happens and that you know it should. Next. And this is the systematic approach. So the steps are: the fracture practitioner is not sitting there waiting for someone to knock on her door with referrals. She's got to actually go out and find these patients. If you rely on referrals, it will not happen. And time again will tell you that. And the literature is full of studies where they tried interventions to increase referral rates. So you're going to miss those at highest risk if you don't case find. They've got to screen them appropriately. Treatment, educating the patient and monitoring is really important, because you can see that less than half will be on treatment 2 years later probably. Next. But just by having an FLS does not mean it's effective. Next slide. So there are numerous reasons as to why it will fail. And I mean, there are many where they just have one FLS nurse, great, we've ticked the box, we've got a service. When actually there are probably 5 times more fractures than she can deal with. Often she'll have no IT support whatsoever to even help with the case finding, no actual space or resource to see patients. No time, as we know from the facilities as well, to even put cases onto the actual database, the national database. So therefore, no means to examine their practice. Often the clinician support isn't there either. You know, there are some who are running, and Erin may talk about it in the facilities, where there really isn't enough clinician support to aid a lone practitioner trying to do their best with these patients. And then no time, critically, to follow up the patient, see, are they on treatment? Next slide. So the Capture the Fracture campaign concerns the standards for running an FLS. Next slide. So it's a global campaign. Next. Ireland have a few stars, but we're a long way off getting a coveted gold star. Now, granted, it is self-declared, but it's a fairly rigorous evaluation of your services. There is no centre in Ireland that has a hope of getting one, as I say, based on the current state of play, the staffing numbers, etc. Next. They have key performance indices similar to the hip fracture database, and that's what we're following for the Irish Fracture Liaison Service database as well, concerning where and how you find your fractures and the patient level data of how they are risk assessed, treated and monitored. Next slide. Does this work at a population level? Well, this was the Kaiser Permanente Healthy Bones Programme. This was a mass increase in screening for osteoporosis following a fracture. Next. And they did projections of their expected versus actual hip fracture rates. Now, as to how they calculated their expected, okay, they used some age factor as well. I was open to slight criticism, but nobody has doubted this really effective service. It's really impressive. But if you're going to have a kind of a bit part fracture liaison service and you're not capturing all your fractures, you're not going to do this. But if you roll it out properly, and we in Ireland are a small enough population that we really could do this, if we roll out effective services, we could really make inroads into hip fracture numbers, and that's a really impressive effort from them. Next. Next, this is the economic impact. There are several studies on fracture liaison service. Now, they're difficult studies, obviously, to conduct, to do a randomised trial, and you certainly wouldn't get away with it now, because it's a no-brainer that all patients should be going through an FLS. So the few randomised studies are there with pre and post studies. Having an FLS will increase BMD testing, treatment initiation, adherence, and probably reduces refracture rates. Now, the evidence, as I say, is not robust because it's not placebo-controlled trials, but it really does make an awful lot of sense. And it's pretty much accepted, you know, worldwide, that this is something we all need to adopt. Next. So I'll leave you over to Erin then, just to talk further about the fracture liaison database and how we started up, and how we hope to really make inroads into how our fractures are managed and ideally, if we roll it out, hip fracture numbers in Ireland. Thank you.
Francis, thank you very much. That's a fantastic outline of the problem and how we can fix the problem. But the issue is we need to get moving on this problem. There's a lot of problems. I know that one of the things you said is that nobody owns this problem in our if you have diabetes, you see an endocrinologist. If you've a fracture, osteoporosis, is it the orthopedic surgeon? Well, I can tell you from my experience of orthopedic surgeons, and I am one of them, we don't know anything about tablets. So, it's not, whilst these patients frequently have fractures, they're not going to get medical treatment from the orthopedic surgeons. Maybe they should, but generally what we do is maybe get a DEXA scan, which gets sent to the GP, and we recommend that the GP would start treatment for them. And that, as you've said, is not satisfactory. And these patients fall between stools. And that is why we desperately need a database and a fracture liaison service to help these people who, if we had things the way they should be, many of these patients would not suffer catastrophic hip fractures. I'm now going to introduce Aaron Glynn. Aaron is a consultant orthopaedic surgeon who works in Drogheda and Navan, and he has been at the forefront of pushing this project forward. And he's going to tell us about the database, which has started, but needs to become a nationwide function. Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, Paddy. Thank you very much for that. Can I just check? Can people see my screen there? No, I'm just going to go along with the slides here as they are. Okay. All right. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk. Thanks for the invitation. And I'll just run through kind of where we are with the FLS, where we've got in the past couple of years. So next slide, please.
Aaron, can I just interrupt you for 1 second? I'm sorry. I meant to say, if anybody has any questions, we're going to have a question and answer session at the end. So will you send questions in on the chat, and I will monitor the questions and put them to Aaron and Francis at the end. I'm sorry for interrupting you, Aaron.
Thanks, Paddy. No, that's great. That's important. So I suppose we should start by saying that, look, this didn't all start in 2018 with the Trauma System for Ireland report, even though that highlighted the need for a fracture liaison service in Ireland. I think, I think recognition needs to be given to people like Eileen Moriarty, who've been banging on this door for the past number of years, trying to get bone health and falls addressed in older patients. So really, I'd call this start in 2018. I'd call it kind of like Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope, because we're not starting at the beginning, but this is where our journey started. So as Francis said, the Trauma System report from 2018, the HSE identified the need for a national FLS. And a steering group was appointed by Paddy Kenny and Dave Moore, who are the clinical leads of the National Clinical Programme in Trauma and Orthopaedics, set up a steering group. And Catherine Farrell and Niamh Keane in the college did an enormous amount of work, the background work, getting our terms of reference together, setting up a multidisciplinary team, because traditionally, as Francis says, fragility fractures are the unwanted child of orthopedics and rheumatology and geriatric medicine and endocrinology, and we're all kind of pointing our fingers at each other and involving GPs and physiotherapists and saying, shouldn't you be doing this, and what are we doing? And so there needs to be very much a coordinated approach. So I think this is the first time there's been a really coordinated approach across all the different specialties to address this problem in Ireland. So next slide, please. So as Francis has said, I'm sorry, there will be a little bit of repetition on some of these slides, but when we started out initially, we decided to look at the International Osteoporosis Federation to look to see what they were doing in terms of capture the fracture. And the mainstay or the main goals were to identify the patients at risk, to investigate the risk for further fractures, and to initiate treatment. You can see there's a lot of fracture liaison services actively all over the world. Next slide, please. But I think in Ireland, we're certainly short of, we've 16 trauma sites in Ireland, and certainly we don't have 16 FLSs, and that's really the goal of the fracture liaison service at a national level, is to get a local FLS in you know, and that can be based in the trauma hospital itself, or it can be based in a, you know, an additional level 2 hospital if it's affiliated with that hospital, or it can be located in the community. You know, there's no hard and fast rule for how an FLS should run, because a lot of the ones that are running currently in Ireland might be located in the community, might be located in a peripheral hospital that's not necessarily a trauma hospital. So there's no kind of one size fits all for this. You know, there's a lot of kind of local practices that we should encourage and build on, rather than coming in and saying, no, that's wrong, this is the only way to do it. But certainly Kazim Javed, who was the clinical lead for this in the UK, did identify the fact that the ones that were more successful tended to be based in secondary care rather than primary care. And maybe that's a resource issue, as Francis said, that GPs are just simply, you know, overwhelmed with the workload, the varying workload, and that, you know, FLS, it is a little bit specialized, and there is a lot of changing data on prescribing practices and need for investigation. So maybe it should be run at a secondary level. Next slide, please. And as Francis said, you know, the success of the Irish Hip Fracture Database has driven standards. You know, it certainly had a vast improvement on hip fracture care in Ireland. And really, you know, the success of a database is if you can measure a problem, you know, where the treatment gaps are, and you can address those and make sure that patients are properly, you know, that case finding happens, that we find the patients who are at risk, get them on board, get them investigated, get them treated, and make sure we follow up with treatment. So a database is key, because you can audit your practice, you can see where the treatment gaps are and make sure they're addressed. So gathering data is your most powerful tool for addressing it, certainly at a national level. So we followed the practice in the UK, where they set up the first national fracture liaison service database. So we aim to be the second national database. And we set up a pilot site where we take about 5 hospitals initially. It turns out we actually ended up with 8, because there is a lot of enthusiasm out there for people to be involved with this. We managed to get a program manager, Kenny Franks, appointed. We stole Kenny from NOCA, which was brilliant, because ultimately we hope to fall under the umbrella of NOCA, but really to do that, we need to show that it's a successful model, that it's something that can be achieved, and B, can produce data with a view to preventing fracture numbers in due course. So we're hoping that if we can get a successful pilot going over a couple of years, that we will ultimately come under the umbrella of NOCA. And so Kenny Franks was a great find, and he's been extremely helpful with getting this project going. So we aim to be the second national database after the UK. We currently have 8 pilot sites. Funding was generously donated from pharma, because I suppose they ultimately stand to gain from increased prescription practice. Really, the goal of an FLS is to get a patient under drug. Again, Kazim Javed said, you know, you can talk about strength and balancing, you can talk about Tai Chi, but it's very hard to actually monitor that people are doing those. And I mean, God, we all know that people aren't the best at looking after their health. They would rather take a tablet than go for a 5-mile walk in the sun every day, which would, you know, prevent a large amount of osteoporosis. But people would rather take a tablet. And he said that has been shown in so many studies to actually improve bone health as opposed to other means, unfortunately, but there we are. So we did get funding from pharma. Amgen and UCB are 2 companies who have an anti-osteoporosis medication, and they have generously funded a 2-year pilot program. Next slide, please. So again, we're building on the success of the Irish Hip Fracture Database. As Francis said, this was set up in 2016 and has resulted in year-on-year improvements in hip fracture care. So this is a template we're following. Next slide, please. So the UK Fracture Liaison Database was set up in 2016, and they're collecting data from 61 sites on about 60,000 patients. And we were told that, look, you know, in the start, when you start off, you will have a lot of red boxes where data isn't being produced. There's 11 KPIs used. I'll go into those in a little bit more detail again, but you know, we were advised that this is not a project that'll give a rapid, you know, that you'll get rapid buy-in by every hospital and get rapid data collected on every patient. You know, there's a lot of blanks in the database, and really it just emphasizes again how this problem is ignored and how fragility fractures really fall between stools, and the impetus isn't there to address fragility fractures, even though there's huge cost savings to be made in terms of reducing morbidity for patients. And also there's a huge financial gain to be made, because if you look at our CSO figures for Ireland, our population is aging and we're living longer, and there's more old people, and the cost of not addressing fragility fractures will simply overwhelm the health service within about 10 to 20 years, because as Francis has shown, the bed days taken up by fragility fractures are, they exceed those of cardiac events and strokes. So, it's a huge need. Francis' other great line that I noticed she didn't use, but it's a great line, I think, is that you wouldn't not treat hypertension to reduce the risk of someone having a stroke. And yet, there isn't the same concern with treating fragility fractures. And that just beggars belief, because the more risk of morbidity and mortality for patients, and also the financial burden for society it makes it a no-brainer. So anyway, the UK FLS produced their report from their database. They've produced a report every year for 4 years now, and they still have a lot of data not completed, and they're not finding the case numbers they should be finding, not treating the number of patients they should be treating. So we're not alone, I suspect, in that we're not going to be identifying those patients, but it just shows the treatment gap that's out there. Next slide, please. So these are the KPIs used. They look at data completeness for the patients. They look at are they identifying all fragility fractures? And there's kind of a figure out there of 5 to 1. So you should be finding 5 fragility fractures for every hip fracture. As Francis said, hip fractures are admitted. They appear on HYPE data forms. And, we know how many hip fractures we have. We've got about 5,700 hip fractures every year in Ireland. So it's estimated that there's 5 fragility fractures for every hip fracture. So, there's about 30,000 fragility fractures out there. So we should be capturing up that number. Spinal fractures are the third. Oh, sorry, just go back one there, please. Sorry, yeah. Spinal fractures are a very important one, because there is some papers suggesting that the most the fragility fracture with the highest risk of having a subsequent fracture is a vertebral fracture. Sorry, a subsequent hip fracture is a vertebral fracture. So if you can capture the number of patients with vertebral fractures, you have a higher chance of preventing hip fracture down the line. I suppose that's simply a numbers game, because you've got so many vertebrae as opposed to, you've only 2 wrists, and you've, like at least 7 thoracolumbar vertebrae that are at high risk of fracture. So I suppose it's just a numbers game, really. But certainly, if you can identify patients with spinal fractures, you can dramatically improve health outcomes for those patients. So the other KPIs looked at are the number of patients who are assessed by the FLS within 90 days of their fracture, percentage of patients having DEXA scans. As Francis said, not everyone needs a DEXA. A lot of patients, over the age of 70, if you sustain a fracture after a fall from standing height, it's a no-brainer that you get treated. You don't need to wait for a DEXA, especially as your risk of subsequent fracture in the 2 years following that index fracture is so high. We also look at patients undergoing falls assessment, so things like visual examination, pharmacology review to make sure they're not on tablets causing drowsiness or dropping their blood pressure or causing postural hypertension, bone therapy being commenced within 4 months of their index fracture, strength and balance training being commenced within 4 months of their fracture. Maintaining contact to ensure compliance with treatment is another KPI, and then adherence to anti-osteoporosis medication at 12 months post-fracture. And as Francis said, there's a huge fall off in the number of patients who get started on a drug, and then at 12 months, a huge number of those patients have dropped off. They're no longer compliant with their medication. That may be due to side effects, or it may be due to poor information, maybe due to rationale of polypharmacy by a lot of geriatricians out there now. I suppose most of them wouldn't be stopping the anti-osteoporosis medication, but polypharmacy has been identified as a problem for elderly patients. So these drugs may be one of the first ones to be struck off by other healthcare professionals. Next slide, please. So we decided to really adopt the same standards as the UK FLS database. Obviously, we're not looking at they take hip fractures on board. We won't be doing that because of the strength of the Irish hip fracture database. But we'd expect that we should have four other fractures for every hip fracture. And we also decided to use Crown Informatics, who are the UK company who are providing the software for the UK FLS database, simply because they deliver a good product. They have a very good reputation in the UK. They made themselves available over here to us for a pretty low price because it was only 8 pilot sites. And we didn't have to go through a tendering process, which is the advantage of being funded by a pharma for a pilot study for 2 years. So I suppose once we go into the auspice of NOCA, we'd have to re-tender our IT support. So that could be another challenge in the future. Next slide, please. We also got a little bit political. That's one of the recommendations from the Capture the Fracture, the IOF. They recommend that you engage, all local health stakeholders. So we got to meet some of the non-governmental health people, if you will. So we managed to meet Jim Daly, who's kind of leaving office as Minister for Older People. We got to meet Colin Burke in Fine Gael. He's a spokesman for health in Fine Gael. We didn't have any luck with meeting Stephen Donnelly or Mary Butler, who's the Minister for Older People. But we did meet with David Conlan, Roisin Shortall, people who have an interest in health or who are, and Marion Harkin in Sligo was another great person to meet and talk with. People who have an interest in healthcare or who are opposition spokespeople for health. It's a little bit harder to meet the sitting Minister for Health, but word did get back to Stephen Donnelly because he visited Drogheda and he specifically asked to speak to our FLS nurse. So that was great that we had someone in post who could, they was able to, spend about 10 minutes talking with. And it seems that there may be some funding promised through the scheduled care program to help fund FLS services nationally. So we're keeping our fingers crossed for that one. As you know, there was 350 million extra allocated. 150, I think, of that went to NTPF funding, and then there's this 200 million out there that's sloshing around for different pilot projects and health improvement projects. So we're hoping to get a slice of that pie down the line, but we're still waiting to hear. It's been a long time promised that we should be getting something, but we're still waiting to hear. I suspect some people in this audience may have heard they're being guaranteed funding. Probably another 30% of people suspect they may be getting something, but not sure how much. And then there may be another 30% of us who think we're going to get something, but probably might end up disappointed down the line. But we really think FLS is something that should be funded because it is so important. Next slide, please. So we also did a facilities audit, and this was again based on the program in the UK. There was one, as Francis had recommended, this was one of the first things we should do. So it was a postal survey with all the 16 trauma sites in the country to see if they had a fracture liaison service in post or in place, and what kind of numbers were they capturing. So we wrote to the 16 trauma sites, and the paper was published recently in Osteoporosis International. Next slide, please. The findings are summarized. So of the 16 trauma sites, 10 of them have an FLS in existence. Most of them are still pretty new. We're not seeing the numbers of patients we should be seeing. We're only capturing about 19% of the patients we should be seeing. Lack of resources was identified as the biggest challenge, having dedicated personnel in post. So in the UK, they published this year that they have, for about 560,000 patients, I think they had 1.5 A&Ps or equivalent. So that could be an A&P or a CNS or a physiotherapist or a radiographer, or someone in that role of looking after data for hip fractures, for fragility fractures. And then they'd have about 0.43 whole-time equivalents of admin staff, which we don't have at all. Like, we've nothing like that. So lack of resources is our biggest challenge. Next slide, please. Of the patients then, we're only capturing about 45% of patients that we should be finding. of whom only about 50% are getting adequately treated. So it really shows that there's a massive treatment gap at a national level for patients with fragility fractures, and there's a huge target there that if we can get those patients within 2 years of sustaining their index fracture, we know from the published literature that we can prevent patients sustaining hip fractures down the line. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges? Well, as I've said, lack of resources, lack of personnel is our main challenge, and lack of funding for those posts. So we should ideally have, it depends on, you can crudely look at the number of hip fractures in your unit, and then you can estimate that you should have 5 times that number of fragility fractures. And you can allocate staff based on that. But some units should have, 2 A&Ps dedicated and maybe a half admin or half whole-time equivalent admin person available. We've nothing like that at the moment. There's been challenges with pre-existing software systems. I know Kenny has broken his heart with some of the software systems that are out there that people are using for their FLS, that they're kind of pre-existing systems that the data can't be retrieved from it to submit to Crown, but then people don't want to give up that data because they've built up a database, and their current software allows them to print letters off to GPs. So there's been a lot of challenges, and to Kenny's enormous credit, he's managed to crack that and get some of these existing systems to get their IT support people to allow to facilitate transfer of data from those programs to the Crown database. So that should, make life a lot easier in some units for uploading data. Obviously, COVID has been the biggest challenge because our personnel were withdrawn from a lot of units that did have an FLS A&P in post. They would have been taken away for swabbing or screening or vaccinations, so or else personnel being out sick with COVID. So it's been a massive problem over the last 2 years. So hopefully, touch wood, we're rounding that curve. The other challenge, I suppose, is still funding. As I've said, we're waiting to hear from Scheduled Care. The Scheduled Care program kindly took us on. We did some work with a integrated care team for older people, and they were very supportive as well, because there's a huge crossover in patient population with the older persons integrated care team. But fragility fractures there's still that kind of forgotten child between so many services like orthopedics, rheumatology, endocrinology. So we're still trying to find a home because of the HSE streaming, the different streams of funding. Should we be part of unscheduled care, scheduled care, the national trauma program, and everyone's kind of looking at each other going, can you guys look after this, because it's not quite under our remit, so just the HSE funding structure just makes it a little bit challenging to get funding under any one program. Next slide, please. This is a very busy slide. I'm not going to go into it, but this slide we produced. It's the scheduled care wanted the data presented in such a way, and because they deal with chronic disease, they really want to see kind of a pathway for how conditions are treated, going from GP to secondary care to back out to the community. So that's kind of their model of care. And fragility fractures don't really fit into that because most patients don't go to their GP with a fracture. They actually go to A&E, and then they might get admitted, and they might get admitted under a different team, and then they might not ever be referred to an FLS, or some of them might be over-investigated. You see these patients and they're having annual DEXs, and you're like, oh, what the hell is this about? So it seems to be a feast or a famine for some patients. So we kind of had to rejig the patient pathway to fit the scheduled care pathway. But really, it's all about the patient presenting with a fragility fracture and making sure that they're followed up appropriately by an FLS, and their basic risk is assessed for a secondary fracture, whether that's simply being started on medication straight away or whether they need to be referred for DEXA. The other side of medication then is being referred for physiotherapy for strength and balance training to reduce their further fracture risk, and also for falls assessment for all the other things I mentioned, such as visual impairment, polypharmacy, different other causes of poor balance, etc. So it's quite an involved process, and each step in the way there's a KPI in that. So we have to try and link all that in. So that took a little bit of work. So mainly credit to Kenny and Francis for that. Yeah, you can go next slide there. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of our timeline to date, where we are from starting the steering group in 2018, getting a project manager appointed for the database, our facilities audit, getting that published. We've had a national webinar. We're now doing a national workshop on Friday. Hopefully somebody will be there. But the most important thing really is getting the data from our 5 to 8 units that were designated as pilot sites over the past year. So next slide, please. So this is our kind of first year. So this is our 2021 data. So these are the actual, in the red column here is the actual number of fractures identified. The number of non-hip fractures then is, sorry, this is the estimate of non-hip fractures based on that 5-to-1 formula. And the last column here is the percentage of fractures that we're actually hitting. So you can see that the program in Letterkenny is, they're so efficient that they're actually finding more fractures than they would be expected to find. So they've got, 104% of patients identified, which is incredible. And then everyone's kind of trundling along, anything between kind of low teens to 30% would be the next highest. Some units, TAL is noticeable there, even though TAL have an excellent FLS, they're kind of trundling along the bottom there because they're more focused on following up every fracture, and they're kind of still following fractures from like 2019. So they're not hitting the KPIs. They're not seeing the patients within 4 months. So they're missing out on a lot of KPIs, but they are still seeing and treating patients. So it's a little bit misleading. It looks like they're not doing anything. They are, but we're keeping our KPIs because the evidence shows that getting those patients investigated early, getting them on a treatment program early shows a higher risk of preventing subsequent fractures. So we're going to keep our KPIs as they are. Next slide, please. Oh yeah, we had an interesting evening. We had a kind of a discussion with the New Zealand FLS one evening, and of course was there morning. And we were just catching up with some of the figures that we would have met at the Fragility Fracture Network meeting in the UK from about 2-3 years ago. But it was kind of just a catch up, just to, collaborative catch up, just to see how things were going. And they're very advanced with their service, but we found out why when we found out that over the 4 years between 2016 and 2020, there was 30 million New Zealand dollars. Now that's about 20 million euros invested for a similar sized population. But this was invested by the Accident Compensation Committee of New Zealand. They're kind of like the PIAB in New Zealand. They look after kind of compensation for accidents at a national level. And because they were giving so much money and claims to older patients, they did the maths and they found that if you invest in FLS, that you can prevent so many of these fractures that it's actually worth their while to invest $30 million in this over a 4-year period. So that's how beneficial they realized that it is to invest that. And we're just nowhere near that in terms of funding. So, we really need to up our game because the information's out there, the figures are out there. Next slide, please. So what are our future plans? Well, we're hoping to roll out our pilot site. We're hoping to eventually take on all 16 trauma units in the community, not even just trauma units, but also any FLSs that might be out in the community as well. We need at least 1 A&P, probably 2 for busier units with admin support. That's key. We're hoping to produce an annual report over time every year, and there will be a lot of red boxes. There will be a lot of missing data for the first couple of years, and we know that, and that can be a bit disheartening, but I think once you know that and you use those missing boxes to drive improvement in the service, because that's what the database is all about. It's about driving improvement. We'll continue political engagement. Hopefully we'll get a little bit more, that we will get some funding to get us up and going this year, and that we can drive on that, we can improve that and continue with engaging people because we really need to get this message across to the people with the purse strings that there's cost savings and also huge benefits for society in terms of preventing morbidity, keeping people in their homes, keeping people out of hospital, keeping people in the community. And we're hoping over time that we'll integrate with NOCA over time. So, but we have to show that we're kind of a successful model and we can get the data on board, I think, before they'll take us on. But they have been very helpful with us behind the scenes to date. So I think that's my last slide. There's a few people I would like to thank. I mean, thanks first and foremost to everyone who's tuned in tonight. If anyone has any questions, please share them. We'd love to hear those. But there are a few people at RCSI level who I really need to thank. So Catherine Farrell and latterly Ruth Kiley, who've been were the program managers for the National Clinical Program Trauma and Orthopaedics, and along with Niamh Keane, have been hugely helpful to us the whole way. Derek Johns in the RCSI has been extremely helpful. Kieran Ryan has been very good, and everyone in NOCA that we've approached has been more than helpful. So I'd really like to thank all those people, and of course Paddy Kenny and Dave Moore for getting us going in the first place. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks very much, and well done. Kenny, I don't see any questions coming through on the chat. Have you seen any?
No, Paddy.
Okay. Well, Aaron, thanks very much. You between Francis and yourself, you've highlighted what the issues are. There's a lot of difficulties going forward, but this fracture liaison service will become a national program. But we need leadership in so many different areas. Having said that, I've been trying to get the thing up and running in the hospital that I work in since we started at this, and I'm still at the stage where I'm filling out business cases for advanced nurse practitioners to run the fracture liaison service, and I'm not making much progress. But I would encourage anyone with any interest to talk to their director of nursing about getting an advanced nurse practitioner for specifically for fracture liaison services. On a more hopeful note, I would say that I was there at the very beginning of the Irish hip fracture database, and like that, and we started similarly. We had no money. We had just a few of us starting up a committee to get it going, and we started with pharma funding, and eventually, once we had some data to bring to the government and the RCSI, the thing took off and has been a great success. Having said that, it was very easy to see the benefit of the hip fracture database very quickly because of the improvement of patients' cares. Fracture liaison service is a slow burner. You know, you're not going to see positive results within 2 years. You will see positive results probably within 4 years. But I do think that there's tremendous effort has gone into this, particularly from Francis and Aaron, but also from the rest. We have a wider committee. There's a huge amount of work has gone into it, and of course Kenny Franks is holding the whole thing together and driving it very well. And I think he needs to be commended above anybody else involved. He works so hard on this. The last thing I have to say is we do have a meeting on Friday morning. If anybody online is interested, we're having a meeting in the College of Surgeons, an in-person meeting to discuss with people who were involved in the fracture liaison service the good bits and the bad bits from the different units and how we can help to improve each other's fracture liaison service. So I think unless anybody has anything else to comment, we're going to sign off. Any last comment, Francis or Aaron?
No, nothing from me. I think we've covered it well, and as I say, it's just about asking where your FLS is and keeping it up with the business cases, because this has to happen.
Yeah. Kenny, have you any last comment?
No, Paddy, just I put in my chat the email. If anyone wants to attend the workshop on Friday, they're more than welcome to join. So just drop me an email.
Aaron?
No, that's great. Thanks, Paddy. Hopefully see most of you on Friday.
Great. So I'll see you on Friday, and thank you very much to everyone, and thanks to the College of Surgeons for hosting the webinar. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.